Good evening, everybody. My name is Holger Klein, and I'm the director of the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies here at Columbia. It is my great honor and distinct privilege to welcome you all to tonight's keynote lecture and panel discussion, which serves as the opening session of our conference on Eurasia and China's Belton Road initiative. The conference brings together international experts, scholars, and practitioners to examine the expansion of China's Belton Road initiative, short BRI, across Eurasia and how different actors from the region have responded to it. The conference will in particular take a close look at the potential for conflict and disputes related to BRI projects, both from a legal and a political perspective, and ways to settle them. We are kicking off our conference here at Barnard Hall this evening with a keynote and a discussion on this overarching theme entitled Eurasia and the Belton Road Initiative, Potential Impact, Potential Disputes, and How to Address Them. And I'm thrilled to see such a large audience for this event. Before I turn the podium over to my colleague, Professor Alexander Cooley, who will serve as the moderator and master of ceremonies for tonight's keynote and discussion, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to a number of people and institutions in and outside of Columbia University who have made our conference a reality. First of all, I would like to express my special thanks and deep gratitude to Professor Ahmet Evin, Senior Scholar at the Istanbul Policy Center, Founding Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Sabancı University, and Professor Emeritus at Sabancı, for initiating this conference and leading its preparation with the assistance of François Garel-Billard, the Sakıp Sabancı Center's Associate Director, and Sharon Kim, our Program Manager. Without their tireless efforts on many levels, this conference would have been impossible to organize and to mount. I would also like to acknowledge the support of the Sabancı family, who made the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies a vibrant reality here on Morningside campus, and our colleagues on the center's executive committee and advisory board for their steadfast support over the past 2 years of academic programming. Most importantly, however, I would like to thank the main co-sponsors of our conference, first among them the Istanbul Policy Center Stiftung Mercator initiative at Sabancı University. Here at Columbia, I would like to extend my gratitude to our co-sponsors at the Harriman Institute for Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies, the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy, the Columbia Global Centers Istanbul, and last but not least, the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. Without their intellectual and financial contributions, we would not have been able to mount this important conference and tonight's event, which will be recorded and we hope will be made available on the center's website soon. It is now my great pleasure to introduce the moderator of tonight's lecture and discussion, Alexander Cooley, who will in turn introduce our keynote speaker and the panelists. Professor Cooley is the Claire Tow Professor of Political Science at Barnard College and Director of Columbia University's Harriman Institute. His research examines how external actors, including international organizations, multinational companies, NGOs, and foreign military bases, have influenced the development, governance, and sovereignty of the former Soviet states, with a focus on Central Asia and the Caucasus. He's the author and editor of 6 academic books, including most recently Dictators Without Borders, Power and Money in Central Asia. And in addition to his academic research, Professor Cooley serves on several international advisory boards and has testified for the United States Congress and the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission. His opinion pieces have appeared in the New York Times, Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs, and his research has been supported by several prestigious grants and fellowships. Please help me to welcome Alexander Cooley to the podium.
Thank you, Holger, and good evening, everyone. It is just a pleasure and an honor to be tonight's moderator for the keynote. When we first thought about the conference and we were putting our heads together, we thought, of course, the Belton Road is a very hot topic that bridges together many different regions, many different functions and disciplines. And then when we thought about, well, who could pull everything together and who could actually give us a perspective in and across Eurasia, understanding all the different political, cultural, normative issues, I'm pleased to say we got our person. Because Dr. Bruno Maçães has already made a worldwide name for himself, primarily through his two of his books, the latest being The Dawn of Eurasia on the Trail of the New World Order, and also a book on the Belton Road, A Chinese World Order. Dr. Maçães is currently a senior advisor at Flint Global in London, where he advises companies on international politics, and he's also senior fellow at Renmin University in Beijing and the Hudson Institute in Washington. I think he's on a plane a lot. Prior to this, he bridged also these different roles. He was Secretary of State for European Affairs for the government of Portugal, and he received his doctorate in political science from Harvard University, also serving as a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington and the Carnegie Institute in Brussels. So he also knows DC and Brussels. He is a regular commentator beyond his writings. He's got very creative pieces out in venues like Politico, Financial Times, Guardian, Foreign Affairs, and he's on CNN, the BBC, Bloomberg, and Al Jazeera. I don't have too much else to say, but I can't help notice, I think, a paradox. So it took all of these different institutes and centers all talking about, yes, we need to talk about the Belton Road and dispute settlement and so forth on the Belton Road. And in fact, you know, the way that these regional institutes are divided is a little bit of an artifact, I would say, of Cold War practices. Certainly my institute was set up in 1946. And Weatherhead, of course, also has some links to the kind of, you know, the knowledge for national security purposes nexus. And I think our speaker today is going to show us how the world is actually not divided in these places, how Europe and Asia are, in fact, integrating with all sorts of new possibilities that we hadn't thought before. So I hope this is the first of many collaborations from our institutes, but please join me in welcoming tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Bruno Maçães.
Thank you so much, Alex. Let me thank also Francois. Thank you for the invitation. There are, of course, a good number of institutions that are behind this event. I'm not going to thank them all individually. But it's a great pleasure to be in New York and to speak to you about something that I think is becoming more and more a topic of everyday discussion. What is the Belton Road? What is China up to with the Belton Road? And I'll give you my answer as directly as possible. My book makes one main argument that I think to some extent sets it apart from other books and reports on the Belton Road. I argue that the Belton Road is not about infrastructure. The Belton Road is a global economic and political order, which for the time being exists at the level of aspiration of a project, but which will in time be realized and which will in time be seen as, if it succeeds, as a replacement for the existing global economic and political order. Can this be sustained? We hear about the Belton Road always discussed in terms of an infrastructure project, a set of infrastructure projects all over the world. Is it going too far to say that it is a project for a political order? Well, in fact, I'm puzzled that it is discussed as an infrastructure project. If you go back to the original founding speech by Xi Jinping in Kazakhstan in 2013, he presents the Belton Road as having 5 pillars, and infrastructure is only one of them. And it's pretty obvious that it's an ancillary pillar, and that other things are more important in his view, if you read that speech. When I started looking into the Belton Road around that time, of 2014, officials and academics and intellectuals in Beijing told me that the Belton Road was a long-term project meant to be concluded in 2049, when the People's Republic turns 100 years old. Last year, when I was living in Beijing, actually it became much more common to talk about the Belton Road as a 100-year project. Now, a 100-year project is not an infrastructure project. A 100-year project is not the new Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was implemented and concluded in just a few years. It's something different. It is an idea of order. Now, let's see how this idea plays out. Last week, I was in a meeting in Cambridge on Europe and ideas of order. And we discussed the Belton Road more than anything else, which I thought, and all of us there thought, was particularly revealing. At some point, I suggested that perhaps if we want to write the history of our years in the sort of Cambridge grand history style, you could perhaps say that this is the moment when China became a European power. You know how there's a history of how Russia and the Ottoman Empire became European powers. And both of them, by the way, in the process of becoming European powers, became European, or at least aspired to become European. I don't think that question applies in the case of China, which has no intention of becoming European. But it is a European power. It's present in European politics on a daily basis. I can give you many examples, but let me just call your attention to a very revealing fact that happened a few months ago. The British Secretary of Defense had to resign, received a letter from the Prime Minister saying that she could no longer trust him in a case involving a Chinese company and the extent to which the British government was too compromised with this company. Something that used to happen the other way around, right? There used to be a political crisis in countries in what used to call the third world or the developing world, and there would be a discussion inside those countries of whether Western interests were behind the crisis or not. Now the table has been turned around completely. But in this debate in Cambridge, I turned over and over again to the example of the United States and how the existing American-led global order was built over the last few decades of the 19th century and then the 20th century, for a period that compares rather precisely to what we're talking about when we talk about the Belton Road as a project to be concluded in 2049 or even afterwards. Some people there disagreed and suggested that a better analogy is the rise of Imperial Germany and that it mimics the rise of China better than the rise of America. And that forced me to think why I'm so attracted to the American analogy. And even to question whether there isn't a normative issue here, whether you compare China to America or to Imperial Germany is from a normative point of view not irrelevant. But it was pretty clear to me that the normative question was not in my mind. What was in my mind is, we don't know what the idea of world order that Imperial Germany was trying to implement, and I think it was trying to implement something like that, what it would have turned out to be, because it was not successful. But we know what the idea of an American-led order turned out to be, and we know that if China aspires to replace the American-led order, it will have to compete with it, it will have to imitate it in some respects, it will have to deliver the same results that the American-led order delivers. And those processes are happening already, of imitation, of competition. And that's the reason I think it is useful to compare the Belton Road to the order that America built. I say in the book that the Belton Road may turn out to be something rather similar to the concept of the West. What I suggest in the book is, let's not compare it to an infrastructure project. Let's not compare it to the Marshall Plan. Let's go all the way and compare it to the idea of the West. Two metaphors, the West, Belton Road, two ideas of global order, and if the Belton Road is successful, it may one day be able to compete with the idea of the West as a global order. That's the premise of the book. I think it is an important premise that allows us to understand a number of important things. How the United States is, in some sense, at the center of the Belton Road, as what the Belton Road is aimed against. I think we shouldn't be shy of saying that. Alex was reminding me that in the Obama years, there was for a moment an idea that the United States would even collaborate with the Belton Road. That didn't last long. And I don't believe for a moment that it could have lasted long. It is obvious from a Chinese point of view that the United States is what the Belton Road was conceived against. And we have to recognize these facts as being unavoidable. You look at the maps of the Belton Road, there are no official maps, but there are some that are semi-official. And the most interesting element of the map, I don't like to project them because reality is much more complicated than those maps. It's not easy to capture ideas of global order in the map as opposed to trade routes. But one thing that is obvious in the map and interesting in the map is the United States has disappeared. There's no map of the Belton Road where the United States appears. The Americas have disappeared. If the Belton Road is fully successful, what is at the end is not war. What is at the end is a world where the United States has become insular, where America has become an island on the shores of Eurasia, perhaps very prosperous, certainly safe, but not involved in global affairs, and where the large masses of Eurasia and Africa are in one way or another under Chinese hegemony. The United States is not on the map, and that's not a coincidence. Ideas of Eurasia also, I think, relate to this. Eurasia is the idea of a world where power is concentrated in the Eurasian supercontinent, where the connections between Europe and Asia become more and more important, where the United States is marginal, and where China, one way or another, is able to connect the strategic areas of Eurasia. Imagine a world where China is able to access technology from Japan and Europe, where it's able to sell its products in Europe and Southeast Asia, giant markets where it can access commodities from Russia and the Middle East. Doesn't need the United States anymore. Eurasia, understood as the combination of Europe and Asia, is very much connected to the strategic goals of the Belton Road. I think Eurasia, understood as former Soviet states or Central Asia, is less critical and less central to the Belton Road that people sometimes, for reasons that we can discuss, seem to assume. It's obvious to me, it's developed in the book, and I've seen it more and more in my travels. It's obvious to me that the core of the Belton Road is not in Central Asia. It's in the littoral areas, it's in the sea connections, it's in the massive ports being developed, it's in the Horn of Africa, it's in Southern Europe, it's certainly in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, Malaysia, in Cambodia, and then with the big question mark of India, what role will India play in the Belton Road? But I would argue against believing that Kazakhstan, important as it is what the Belton Road is about. What is the Belton Road about? Why does China need the Belton Road? This, for me, is the best way to address what the Belton Road is. And let me tell you that one of the things that surprised me in my year in China was the extent to which this question is actually asked by intellectuals, by academics, sometimes even by officials. Do we really need the Belton Road? Sometimes it's asked carefully, but other times it's asked in completely blunt and open way. Just before leaving China, about a month ago, I went to give a lecture at Wuhan University, a solidly communist university, very much in the tradition of Mao's thought, and has stayed faithful to that tradition more than other universities that are more westernized. But even there, it was interesting to see one student, a PhD student, stood up at the end and asked me, why do we need the Belton Road? Why are we sending all these jobs abroad? We need jobs here. Why are we spending all this money in other countries? We need that money here. An argument that in the West you would call a prototypical populist argument. But it's asked, and this is important in the discussion in China. And there, as in many other occasions in my year in China, I was the one who had to defend the Belton Road. against my Chinese interlocutor who was ready to let it go. Of course, in an op-ed or in a public lecture by a professor, you will not hear this, but you will hear it in all sorts of contexts. And my argument for the Belton Road was and is as follows. You need the Belton Road because you need to overcome or avoid the middle income trap, which is the problem haunting China. The country is growing in a certain way, addicted to a certain number of sources of growth, cheap labor force, urbanization, easy access to capital. But these sources of growth exhaust themselves. How do you develop a new model of growth, more reliant on technology? How do you overcome the middle income trap, which has been fatal to countries like Brazil in their development paths? The Belton Road is an answer to this for reasons that I will explain. And if you realize this, I think you start to realize how really unintelligible some of the questions we hear about the Belton Road are. I hear the question many times, why is China so focused on the Belton Road? Why don't they focus on technology? I hear the question a lot, why is China wasting its resources on the Belton Road rather than focusing on economic growth? And finally, why is China so concerned with the Belton Road? They should be concerned with Huawei and the problems that the Huawei question raises. Well, as you can guess, I'm going to say the Belton Road is about economic growth. The Belton Road is about technology more than anything else. And the Belton Road is an answer to the questions raised by the Huawei problem. In fact, what you could argue is that the Belton Road perhaps came a little bit too late for Huawei. It's still an open question whether Huawei will survive or not. But the questions that Huawei is struggling with are questions to which the Belton Road answers. How do you access markets, which Huawei needs desperately? How do you control the key technological standards of the future? And how do you ensure safe, reliable value chains, supply chains? These three questions are three questions to which the Belton Road responds, and in light of which the Belton Road was developed. Let's take them in turn. To develop these key technologies of the future, you need huge markets and access to huge markets. The investment is so significant that you cannot have the necessary return of investment if you don't have access to significant markets. Now, the Belton Road ensures that these markets are available through investment, through political connections, through economic connections, through the promise of deepening these connections. You can keep these markets open. And an obvious example is the decision that apparently has been made by Russia to contract Huawei for building a 5G network. Well, without the effort that China has made in terms of establishing the necessary political connections at all levels, without the investment that has already been made, without the promises of further investment, Russia would not take the same decision. So in order to open up markets and keep them open, a process that is also happening in Europe, in places like Italy or Portugal, in Poland, where apparently China has not been as successful as in Russia. The Polish government seems to have made a U-turn and now thinking of excluding Huawei from its network. But this game is going on constantly, all the time, and the Belton Road is the spearhead leading this effort. Now, value chains. You know, that Huawei needs access to reliable suppliers of chips, for example, that cannot be produced in China. And the Belton Road is an effort to develop and integrate these value chains. If you want to find out what the Belton Road really is about, there's nothing better than the document that is not public, unfortunately, but the document prepared by the Chinese National Development and Reform Commission for Pakistan, the long-term plan for Pakistan. The The document is not public because it might raise some eyebrows, the fact that a document detailing the economic future of Pakistan is authored by two entities, the Pakistani Ministry of Industry and the Chinese National Development and Reform Commission. And one might ask what the latter is doing in a plan for the future of Pakistan. But the plan details over 250 pages, much longer than the plan that is public, which is only 40 pages long, what China has in mind for Pakistan. And contrary to expectations in Pakistan, it will not be a plan of industrialization. It will not turn Pakistan into a technology powerhouse. The idea is that Pakistan will provide China with agricultural products, and Pakistan will provide China with low-value textiles that will then be transformed and used by the high-value industry, in particular in Xinjiang, textile industry, with the Urumqi being thought of as a fashion capital for Central Asia in the near future. If China wants to concentrate on high-value segments of value chains, someone else has to take up the low-value segments. Capital and labor are scarce. But you need to conduct this process in a way that is reliable, over which you have control, in a way that is phased. China certainly does not believe in the Western idea that this process should be taken up by private companies and multinationals, because then it can be very disruptive. But it's already ongoing, in some cases being very successful. Value chains are developing, global value chains in nature that start with cobalt mines in the Congo, go through Kazakhstan, and the high-value segments of the value chain are reserved for China. A lot of heavy industry, no longer competitive, very polluting. A lot of the low-value, highly polluting steel industry in China is being moved out into places like Cambodia, where I saw it happen just last month, and Indonesia in particular. I'm going to let you make a value judgment about this, because I think it's quite possible to look at it from both sides. You could say, well, highly polluting industries being moved to other countries. These are low-value segments of the value chain. On the other hand, you could argue, as China does, that for a country like Pakistan that has never industrialized, that it's better to have low-value textile industry than not to have an industry at all. And it's better to have a vibrant agriculture sector with markets that are assured in China, with a 1.5 billion market in China for Pakistan's agricultural products, than not to have a functioning economy at all. And the same for Cambodia and Indonesia. But certainly the idea is to develop sophisticated global value chains that can then compete with European-led and American-led value chains. First element, markets. Second element, value chains. Third element, often forgotten, the key technological standards and the licensing fees and royalties that are behind them. If you take a USB port, a USB port is now present everywhere. You cannot sell a laptop without having a USB port. But it was created by particular companies. Usually the technology is so sophisticated that a good number of companies have part of the copyright. And these companies, every time their technology is used, every time someone sells a laptop anywhere in the world, they receive royalties or licensing fees. And this adds up to billions and billions every year that Chinese companies pay to Western companies to use their technology. Now, China wants to reverse this situation and is thinking very actively of a future where the flow of licensing fees and royalties goes in the opposite direction. And if you look at what Huawei has already done, it's the leading copyright holder for 5G technology. And so in the future, every time a Western company uses those key technologies, China will get a chunk of the revenue. Now, why do you need the Belton Road to ensure this? Because the key technologies are selected in international bodies where each company and each country has a vote. If you have a vast network of political and economic connections, you can, as Huawei has succeeded, get to these international bodies and get a majority and approve your technology as the key technology, the standard technology for many of these new products being developed. And this didn't happen in the past. China learned a lesson from 4G, where it lost this battle and promised that it would not lose the battle for 5G, with already very encouraging results when it comes to controlling these key technologies of the future. So on technology, on value chains, on markets, we see that the Belton Road is leading the way for a Chinese economy that occupies the high technology segments of the world's economy. So when people say, why doesn't China focus on technology rather than the Belton Road? The Belton Road is about technology, if nothing else. Chinese authorities, Chinese officials, Chinese intellectuals, from that point of view, are faithful Marxists. They understand that the source of power comes from controlling the means of production and controlling technology. We can discuss that later, but I'm always also very surprised. I think my lecture is turning out into an expression of successive puzzlements, but hopefully they can help you think about these things. I'm always surprised when I hear that China is not communist, because I see communism everywhere in China. I see communism in the idea that technology is the engine of history and the source of power. I see communism and Marxism in the idea that the world system is a system of power, not of free exchange. I see communism and Marxism in the idea that the world system is resistant to change, and in order to change it, one needs something like a revolution. And the Belton Road is a revolution, where power will be applied to change the world system in certain directions. So if you look beyond the surface of the advertising and the malls, what is at the core of the current Chinese regime are Marxist ideas with, of course, Chinese characteristics. But I have no doubt that Marx would recognize this immediately if you were in contemporary China, and don't think for a moment that he would think that this is a violation of his core principles. I'll let that there as a slight provocation. Final question, also connecting to the topic of the meeting that will continue tomorrow. Let me put it this way. Does China have a universal model for the world? Does China want to shape the world in a certain way? And I wanted to raise this question, first of all, because it's such an important question. And second, because I'm also here going to disagree with, I think, the mainstream view that you hear a lot, especially from Chinese experts, but not only. You hear a lot the idea that China is not universalist and universalizing by nature. You hear sometimes said that there are two kinds of exceptionalism in the world today. The American exceptionalism, which comes down to thinking that the whole world should become like America, and Chinese exceptionalism, which says China is special, and because it is special, the whole world cannot become like China. China is not interested in exporting its ideas. It's not interested in exporting its economic and political model. Now, this is refuted by official speeches, especially by President Xi Jinping, more and more. And when they are not translated into English or not published, it's even clearer that he's talking about exporting a Chinese model. But I also don't think that it makes a lot of sense once you start to look at the question with some care. And let me very quickly explain why it doesn't make sense to me. Well, first of all, I'm not necessarily interested in looking to the past and considering whether China had in the past the same universalizing tendencies that European countries had. Because Chinese modernity is a more recent development. European countries did not have colonial empires before they did. Before the forces of modern society, which we can discuss, push them in that direction. And I think the same applies to China. It's not relevant to discuss whether Tang Dynasty China had a colonial empire or not, and it didn't, and I will agree with Chinese experts that it didn't. Chinese modernity, whether you consider that it's 50 years old or 80 years old or 100 years old, it's certainly not older than 100 years, modern society in China. I think a plausible anniversary is the May 4th movement in 1919, so now 100 years ago. Chinese modernity is a more recent creation, and this changes everything. In my opinion, modern Chinese society has more in common with modern European society than with classical ancient Chinese society. So we have to wait and see and keep an open mind whether China will develop these universalizing tendencies, whether it will develop something like an empire, more probably of the American kind than of the European kind. Although in a recent visit to Cambodia, I think I saw what European empires used to look like, and we can discuss that. But why would China be interested in exporting its model? What would be the forces pushing it in this direction, whether it wants it or not? And very quickly, let me give you 4 examples of how this could happen. First one, very recently there was a controversy in Europe involving Bosnia. Bosnia is supposed to become, in a not so distant future, a European Union member. Although it's a country where the problems are so serious that one sometimes wonders when this can or will happen. But it is supposed to happen. And so it was with some shock that authorities in Brussels realized that the Bosnian state very recently, just a few months ago, had extended a public guarantee to a Chinese company doing an infrastructure project. This goes so much against the principles of a European economic constitution that the state should not be involved in doing this, that people in Brussels were suddenly afraid that by the time they wake up, Bosnia will have been integrated into a Chinese economic model, and it will be too late to even consider the question of membership, assuming that European member states would be interested in receiving Bosnia and Herzegovina. But you see how it's not that China necessarily is thinking about exporting its model. It wants to do business, but when it wants to do business in Bosnia, it wants to do business the way it does business in China and everywhere else. And so the model moves beyond borders rather more smoothly than one might think. Second example, the internet. Regulation of the internet, political control of the internet. As China exports its internet and 5G technology to African countries, for example, it's obvious, one can imagine very easily, that as executives from Huawei meet officials from Uganda, the conversation naturally will flow into how you can control this technology from your political offices, and we can offer you this. And the African side would be interested in the ideas that the Chinese side will take to the table, and the ideas they will take to the table is the ideas they bring from home. There is nothing conspirational about this, and there isn't nothing particularly ideological about this. Again, you're doing business, but when you do business, you take your ideas. Conceptions of technology. I look at the world today, and roughly speaking, I see 3 philosophies of technology. In Europe, technology is considered something almost by definition problematic. This is happening more and more, unfortunately, in Europe, I think, that should be kept under strict political control. In the United States, technology is encouraged if pursued by the private sector and keeping it separate from the sources of political power. And then in China, of course, technology is almost at the center of the regime. It's pursued politically, and it's seen as something that provides legitimacy and meaning to the political regime. So whether one of these systems and philosophies of technology becomes dominant depends very much on what of these blocks is more economically successful. And finally, my last example, and I'll conclude with that. You'll hear tomorrow, if you're here, a more detailed discussion of the dispute resolution mechanisms that are being conceived for the Belton Road. It is obvious that as investment flows, projects are very complex. There are different interests in play. China clearly wants to be able to organize the Belton Road from a high-level point of view, the main goals and main structure of the Belton Road, but doesn't want to dictate to every country what will be done specifically on every individual point. So it's very tempting to create courts of law that will decide these disputes that arise in a stable, predictable way. But what will be the values organizing these dispute resolution mechanisms? For example, how would one evaluate subsidies given by public authorities to companies? Again, as in the example of Bosnia, it is obvious that the values that will be incorporated into these dispute resolution mechanisms will not be the values of the European Union and will not be the values of the American economy. They will be the values of the Chinese economic constitution. If you read books about, I'll conclude with that, if you read books about how the United States became the world's leading economy and how the United States organized the global order after 1945, if you read the best books on this process, it is very obvious that America did not start with the idea and the plan to create an order in its image. The order collapsed around America, and America was pushed to organize it and to create a new order. And once it did that, it created it in its own image. Because, by the way, it's the only way it did know how to create an order. And I think the same will happen with China. As it creates an order around the Belton Road, it will create an order that reflects its principles. Because even if it didn't want to do such a thing, it's the only way China will know how to create an order. And in that sense, history will repeat itself. Thank you very much.
I'm lucky to have on this panel two outstanding thinkers who can help us dig into some of those observations. And first, immediately on the other end, I'd like to introduce Professor Lanxin Xiang, who's Professor of International History and Politics at the Graduate Institute of International and Developmental Studies, Geneva, and also Director of the Center of the One Belt and One Road Security Studies, China National Institute for SCO International Exchange and Judicial Cooperation in Shanghai. Another person who spends a lot of time on planes. And then right here, Nargis Kassenova, who is a senior fellow at the program on Central Asia at the Davis Center at Harvard University. And she is also associate professor in the Department of International Relations and Regional Studies, director of Central Asian Studies Center and China and Central Asia Studies Center of KIMEP University, which is located in Almaty, Kazakhstan. So, Professor Kassenova, I think I would like to start with you. I think one of the things that we heard is, in fact, Central Asia and Kazakhstan, although they're associated with the Belton Road, they're not at the center of the Belton Road. But I'm curious, from your perspective, you've conducted a lot of research for a lot of different audiences about the relationship between the Belton Road and what is underway in Central Asia. What's your view on the question of the next world order here?
Thank you very much, Alex. First, congratulations on two really excellent books. I read them with great pleasure. They're informative and also very enjoyable to read. Well, first thing, yes, the fact that Central Asia, Central Eurasia is not central for the Belt and Road Initiative, I would agree, and I would say that it is a relief because it removes some pressures. So it's, then you have, when you're not the epicenter of all the attention, all the efforts of outside actors and so on, so forth. So although we are not a big deal for the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI is a big deal for us, of course. Yeah? And China, over the past several decades, not since the announcement of the BRI or Silk Road Economic Belt in 2013, much earlier, had been becoming a very important actor in Central Asia, first and foremost economically, but also in terms of security and increasingly politically. So it is a very big deal for us. So it's a big trade partner, it's a big investor. All our national development strategies are basically in tune with BRI. That's our big hope, yeah, when we kind of envisioning brighter future. But it is becoming also part of the political agenda, and here we are experiencing problems. Those who follow the affairs in the region probably heard about anti-Chinese protests in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. And in Kyrgyzstan, we've seen them for quite some time. But in Kazakhstan, it's, well, a fairly new development. And since the resignation of our first president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, we have them on a regular basis. They're very small, but now they're quite regular. And we also saw the discussion of China and Chinese growing presence in Kazakhstan and in the region, being part of the recent presidential election campaign. So it's becoming part of the domestic political agenda. And I think that's something that is happening not only in Kazakhstan, not only in Central Asia, but throughout the world. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. The more China is growing, the more domestic political agendas in countries throughout the world, yeah, will have China as a central issue. Yeah, and we see it in Africa. We see it in quite a few places. And I think it will be interesting, kind of to think ahead how BRI, if it develops successfully, can function in this world where we see kind of increasing mass political awakening. And that's, I would think it's a global phenomenon. We see it throughout the world. We discussed it in different ways, like the rise of populism and so on, or democratization. But definitely there is something like that. Okay, and China is becoming this important factor. Well, once again, definitely it's not a Central Asian game, it's not a Central Eurasian game, but it's a much bigger game, which, in my view, creates important opportunities for small countries like mine, because it allows to build certain coalitions, yeah, with bigger actors, with more powerful actors. In your book, you discuss the EU connectivity strategy, and you're quite critical of it, if understood correctly. I'm more hopeful in this regard, and I do see certain potential in cooperation between, states of the kind of along the way, the transit states, and the EU for developing a better connectivity. There is this year there was adopted a new EU strategy for Central Asia that talks about the possibility of sustainable connectivity partnerships with Central Asian states, which I think is a promising development. Of course, it's a very tall order, but I think it deserves to kind of really, this opportunity deserves to be explored and pushed. Also, we see the partnership between EU and Japan for developing quality infrastructure in third countries. Now it's one of the priorities of the strategic partnership agreement between Japan and the EU. And Japan already committed a lot of money to pushing this the quality infrastructure enhanced quality infrastructure partnership. So so let's see how it goes, but I think that's an important development. Yeah. It resonates with me what you were saying about the old order disappearing and the new order much more disorienting, appearing in its place. Because I was old enough to kind of to follow more or less consciously the collapse of the Soviet Union, the emergence of newly independent states, yeah, and back then there was a sense of direction. Yeah? So the countries were new. There was nothing, no armed forces, no economy, no foreign policy establishment. But at the same time, there was kind of an idea how things should be. Yeah? And who is the top dog? What are the rules of the game? You know, and you needed to become a market economy, and you needed to become a democracy, and all that. But and even if you couldn't, you were pretending, yeah, that you're sort of trying to be that. Now it's becoming different, yeah. So there are different centers of power, and it's much more disorienting. And of course, I think it's on the one hand a challenge, but as it happens with challenge, it's also an opportunity to kind of to mobilize oneself and make certain choices. And so it's not an automatic thing. You do need to think what the options are and what are the implications of your choices. Now the last thing. So it's not clear what's happening with the. It's not clear to me what this political order that is emerging, is gonna be, and also. How sustainable is the political order of China in your view? To be sort of the center of this new global order, but it is emerging. It's somewhere behind the screen or in the fog, but what is already quite obvious that. That choices already need to be made about with the state governance model, and it's not so much. You mentioned the exporting of the model. If it's not actually exporting, I think in our case it's more importing. That countries like my country, they are importing certain aspects of Chinese governance, yeah. Especially when we look at what's happening with the use of high tech and digitalization and surveillance and so on and so forth. So I think here we also need to think very very clearly about the implications of these decisions and importations. Okay, thank you very much.
Can I just very quickly? I said that,
sure.
that Kazakhstan was not central. Just very quickly, two things about Kazakhstan. And you read my book, so you saw how important Kazakhstan is in my book. So you may have been a bit surprised. I just want to fight that perception that the Belton Road is about the Silk Roads, and it's about these trains that go through Central Asia. Very romantic image. And when the trains are empty, people say the Belton Road is failing. So I want to fight that perception. But there's two things that are important about Kazakhstan. First, it was a pioneering country on the Belton Road, so some of the processes are more advanced in Kazakhstan. And second, it's a country that is, on the question of political order, it's very much equally related to China, Europe, and Russia, and is able to understand these three blocks almost on equally well. Kazakhstan, after all, is a European country, could apply to be a European Union member. Maybe something you could think about.
Now, I'd like to invite Professor Xiang to enter our discussion and conversation from either the perspective of Shanghai or Switzerland or somewhere in between.
It's on, or?
I think
It's already on.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. No, I'm very happy to be here. I just had another speech at CFR in Washington yesterday. I think Bruno has written a very important book because he has raised most of the questions that the commentators in the Western countries so far have neglected. Now, having said that, I still want to say that does not mean I agree with your thesis. Does not mean I agree with your interpretation of the Chinese motivations and what's really behind it at the initial stage of that project. Okay. Well, first, I do have a problem with some master keywords. So, sorry, I don't want to elaborate too much here. Okay. I don't like the word order to begin with. I think first, it's a great, even in the Western language context, you say world order. Usually has the meaning of power balance. This is usually the context of what order is. It's a rather mechanical view in my, I think it's more Anglo-Saxon view, Anglo-American view. Continental Europeans actually not quite. This is, I think, the original thing is Edward Gibbon, of course. He started this tradition talking about rise, fall, this kind of logic. So when the systems, international system changing, how do you need to generalize it? What is the direction of the future change? Okay, it's supposed to be changing guard as well, not just the changing system itself. So the normal, since Edward Gibbon, as far as I can tell, the whole idea is that second coming, whoever in that system, will inevitably challenge the first. Usually end up with violent solutions. Okay, that is very attractive thesis, I think, so far. In Anglo-Saxon world, is so popular. I think Arnold Toynbee took on this a bit. My dear friend Yale, Paul Kennedy picked up in '87. I was Olding Fellow at Yale. I argued with Paul even at that time. Then, of course, most recently, we have Graham Allison of Harvard University. He's talking about Theosophy's trap. There's a long tradition, obsession with that kind of mechanical interpretation of power balance. This is the interpretation order. I really cannot agree. This is the Chinese vision. Now, I appreciate Bruno said Chinese may not become Europeans, but they may beginning to accept some part of European thinking. Now, that's a very subtle point. I don't disagree with that. But the reason for Chinese begin to thinking European probably has a lot to do with what they would call 100-year humiliation. Because before the Opium War, Chinese never thought that way about international order. Okay? They probably were forced to think that way. Today, in my view, China is at a crossroads. Now remember when Xi Jinping came to power, the first thing he did is to talk about tradition. Right? When you talk about modernity, start with May 4th moment, 1990. I totally agree. That's what the Chinese twisted, perverted version of modernity. But it's that, remember the May 4th moment, the main thesis is anti-Confucian tradition. The slogan is, at that time, every student chanting, it's a smashing Confucian house. Right? Communist Party coming from that anti-Confucian tradition. My question to you is, you think Confucianism actually defeated today? You seem to suggest, which I cannot accept that is as a reality. Not even Mao, the most radical anti-Confucians, succeed in defeating Confucius. Remember Mao's last political campaign, almost on his deathbed, 1975, his anti-Confucian campaign. He knew he didn't win, even at his deathbed. Today, of course, it's easily, remember in the West, since China's reform, the most popular phrase is the rise of China. Well, I know every media, every press would use that phrase, which is the most absurd phrase. Which Chinese don't buy it. I don't buy it. There is no rise of China. Okay. Now, what do you mean rise? You mean the Chinese economy has not reaching a very high level of development before? Think about this. According to the OECD massive study of Chinese economy for millennia, 1829, that's the data they collect, Chinese GDP is 32.5 of the global GDP. Okay? That's shortly before the Opium War, as a single country. Now, Chinese had a habit of having trade surplus. Chinese don't know trade deficit, really, throughout history, because they can sell stuff commanding the price, and they don't really import other people's stuff. It's not modern protectionism, it's just no necessity. There is no industrial revolution in China, in the British sense. Now, so the result, of course, is they accumulate so much what today you call the reserve currency, the world, since 18th century, which ended up with Opium War. Why British go for the Opium War with China? Because that balance. Chinese those days are sucking almost all, most of the silver, because we have a silver standard, right? From all over the world, including the newly discovered in Mexico, in the 19th century, 18th century. So it's nothing really new from a Chinese point of view. That is trade surplus, right, which is traditionally something they're used to it. Second, the accumulation of excessive amount of reserve. I'm talking about mentality. I'm not saying you can make a judgment, it's good or bad, perhaps even not really good today, in today's context. But this is something we have seen in the movie before. So don't tell Chinese saying this is a rise China. So Xi Jinping, first thing he did, he used the language called restoration, right? Or I would prefer called the re-rise of China after 100 years or so, relapse, right? So lapse. Now, if you're thinking in that direction, that historic vision, I would say, when you look at it, Belton Road initiative, it's not really creating a Western style, Westphalian style, global order. Especially, I disagree. You said try to replace what's existing liberal international order. I really don't think the Chinese have that ambition, have that kind of motivation. Besides, they benefit enormously from the post-Second World War system. Xi Jinping turned out to be the leading defender of free trade in Davos. I never thought I would see it in my lifetime, Chinese communist leader. But that's another issue that relates to the Trump administration. So what I'm trying to explain to you, several things. I don't want to take too much time to talk about conceptual issues. I want to say Chinese order historically means connectivity, really. That's what the historic view, connecting. It's always the case. Okay. How do you connect? No, you have two ways to maintain the order. If you're thinking in terms of connecting, I think in Chinese language it actually means flood control, right? Order is not a structure. You see, in the West, it's called security architecture, which is very, very Western concept. Chinese never used that in history. Okay? You have a flood, that's chaos. You can contain the flood, then that's order. Well, because we're a rice country, so historically irrigation system is so important. So Chinese develop, but I don't want to get into all the details. Karl Votvogel and many others have written wonderful studies already, volumes on this. Myself, just at this moment, I have a new book coming out on that subject. So it's called A Quest for Legitimacy. I spent 13 years trying to do some deconstruction of one concept, which is legitimacy. It just come out right now. Now, do I have time? Just a specific question.
Specific.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's do it.
After conceptual, I wanted just motivation. Now, what is motivating Chinese doing this? I really don't think there is a grand design. Three things I can think of very briefly. Why they try to do it in 2013? First, there is a geopolitical continuity from the early 21st century. What's happening in Eurasia? Now, Kazakhstan is so important here. I think Kazakhstan actually is pivotal, or Eurasia is pivotal in this picture. Okay? Because Eurasia, at the beginning of the century, after Soviet collapse, suddenly become an area where the major power confrontation are absent. Historically, as you know, this is where all the problems come from. The entire Eurasian landmass, including Europe. Okay? That's what making this famous theory, geopolitics coming from that. Okay? But suddenly you have a lapse of a major power confrontation. Here I'm talking about China, Russia, rapprochement, which is at the beginning you think is not serious. Look at today. Even moving beyond the traditional argument about this is just marriage or convenience, they still hate each other. They probably still hate each other, by the way, as far as I can see. But really beyond that logic, this relationship began to develop it's innate dynamics. Now, second is European, at that time, tried to have a relation with Russia. Now, Treaty Amsterdam has a special clause on this. The third element at that point is China and the EU. China never took EU seriously. I'm talking about EU as an institution until that time. Why? The reason is a global geopolitics. I would put the date at the UN debate on the Iraq war. This is the first time in history you can see there is something like entente. I invent that term, entente active, for that group of four. That's Paris, Berlin, Moscow, and the Beijing. This is a great de Gaulle's concept about Eurasia. You remember de Gaulle during Cold War said, Europe from Urals to to the Atlantic Urals, but that Eurasia was linked all the way to East China Sea. That geopolitical factor is crucially important. Now, second, economic reason, just quickly, I don't want. Economic reason, one is, at that point, is China really needs to export overcapacity for the infrastructure. It is an infrastructure program-led initiative. Okay? Still is at this moment. Now, third is the failure of China's Western development strategy, which was adopted during Jiang Zemin time already. Now, remember, Chinese reform created major problem imbalance. East Coast, most of the activities there. Center and the Western China, the gap is so huge, the entire economy become unbalanced. So Jiang Zemin period already started this grand, ambitious project. It's called the Great Development Strategy West. It never really worked. So this Belton Road concept, a new Silk Road concept, tried to continue to revive, to rescue that, because most of the activities along that direction. And Central Asian peaceful condition provide that opportunity for extending the project to that. So they are very practical. They never thought about technology at the beginning. Now, I agree with you. Today, it's a totally different picture. Okay. Technology, finance, many other things, but has a lot to do with Trump administration as well.
Very interesting.
Okay, I stop here.
Thank you. So, Bruno, would you like a short response? Because I want to pose a sharp question to the panel. Yeah.
No, very short. I was going to say a few things, but I'll just focus on one. I do think that Chinese leadership saw the problem before it realized itself. And the problem is not Trump. Because, of course, when Japan started to be a threat to the American-led order, we had the Plaza Accords, where Japan was forced to, because of its security dependence, and because the political culture in Japan was different. Japan, after all, was defeated in the Second World War, and China was not, and that's crucial. And so Japan gave up on its ideas, which it had in the 80s, of becoming a real rival to the United States. Now China is not going to give up on its ideas, and so the leadership could see that Trump or no Trump, this problem would arrive. 2013 was a way to start preparing for it. And again, you know, I don't think there was a mistake. I think it maybe came 3 or 5 years too late, if you want to make a judgment on it. And then on question of Confucianism, you know, of course, I'm not an expert on Chinese culture, but I mean, in China, technology is the center of everything. You know, when the decision on Huawei was made to include Huawei in the entity list, there was an earthquake in Beijing. Everyone overnight changed their discourse. There was a deep trauma. Decisions were made. Attitudes became rigid. They were not going to change again. One could actually think that was a mistake from the Trump administration because you're never going to be able to deal with the same China again. And so what is the core of the Chinese regime? Is it Confucianism or is it technology and the idea that China can lead the technology of the future? Because I never see the same passions being awakened because of a discussion on moral issues in China.
So one interesting point Nargis brought up was that does China aim to export these things, or do countries themselves see favorable benefits, characteristics, even an opportunity to push away parts of the existing order that they don't like and replace them with substitutes that don't carry the same baggage? I think one interesting small country we haven't talked about that might be instructive is that of Greece. Now, of course, I direct a Russian and Eurasian studies program, and so I think when the new Greek government back then, the Syriza government came to power, there was concern, well, is Syriza going to be the weak link in the economic sanctions against Russia? Right? And of course, the prime minister got an invitation to the Kremlin. He was given an Orthodox cross by Putin. And there was real concern that this would be sort of the way in for Moscow. But that didn't happen. Actually, Greece held firm on sanctions and so forth. What did happen, though, in June 2017 was that Greece vetoed an EU criticism of Chinese human rights. It was the first time Greece has ever done this, has broken ranks. And the Greek foreign minister said, you know, it's not very constructive to put out such critical condemnatory resolutions. Of course, we know about investment in the port of Piraeus, the Greek Golden Visa program, through which now there are 10,000 residents in Greece who have obtained residency through this 250,000 euros of investment. So I take it there hasn't been any, I think, high-level sort of conspiring between Greece and Beijing on this road, but certainly Greece has altered its behavior, right? I think because of a certain position that it was at. So so I'd like to hear from all of you, because in some ways we talk a lot about the top-down, but not so much about the bottom-up, right? Even if this isn't intended by Beijing, what is the likelihood that governments themselves will start picking and choosing what they want out of a particular situation?
You mean the member? You mean the supposed member of the Belton Road?
Yes, yes, indeed. Yeah,
along the line. I be honest. I cannot generalize. I don't like to do generalization about how successful, what's going on. Since I took over this think tank in Shanghai, which, by the way, is the president himself announced in Bishkek on that project, my institute, by the way, in Shanghai. I had the opportunity visiting, so far, about 30% of the countries, which means less than about, 20, 25, 27. We're covering every continent. I see vast differences. It's almost impossible to generalize what exactly is happening. I go there basically talking to our people on the ground. That's the first thing. You know, our companies, what they are doing there. Okay. What's their problem there? Then I talk to the host countries. Each country has a very different problem. Let's say American favorite argument is a debt trap, which I think you did not pay. I think you actually did not completely buy that argument in your book, but that's very popular. Pence, Pompeo, they keep on saying this, as if there is a grand strategy for China to use debt finance as a set up the trap for this country to fall in there. No, it's not the case at all. Yeah. Some cases they are in trouble. Some cases we are in trouble. Remember, the debt issue is who trap whom.
And just to reinforce your point, Professor Xiang, it's actually in the new national strategy, U.S. strategy towards Africa of 2017, that Bolton authored, talking about the predatory nature of Chinese lending and investment in Africa. Nargis, I'm curious about your perspective on the countries themselves being the sources of drivers of this, either in Kazakhstan or some other Central Asian cases that you might be familiar with.
Because that's the point I was trying to make. Well, that's the point I was trying to make, and actually, I very much like the point about technology being so super central to kind of this new unfolding story about political order, let's put it this way. Because, well, definitely our countries, our authorities, they're not interested in copying the Chinese political system, the Communist Party, and all this stuff. But they appreciate this know-how of controlling society with the help of technology, and that's the kind of sort of the biggest thing now in the region. They all want digitalization, e-government, and all that, and basically they want to improve their governance. They want to be more functional states, but not through the kind of improving accountability, having elections, democratic processes, and this kind of stuff. So where they can take this from, there's definitely there are examples out there. So there seems to be a good fit. Yeah. So our governments, they want better governance. Yeah, they want to be legitimate, but at the same time without this kind of normal processes.
Perfect. So let's bring in the conversation, bring in the audience into the conversation. You've all been very patient. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. And I think, do we have microphones to come around? Yep. So just wait for the microphone, please, and just state your name. And if you could keep your question relatively brief so we have time to include as many as possible, we'd greatly appreciate it. So yes, please, in the front here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Marie Terrell, I'm a alumni of Columbia and a former lecturer at the Harvard Central Asia Forum, and also former professor at the Department of Defense on Central Asia, Eurasia. My question, let's talk a little bit about the problems. It seems like there are lots of problems. So, for example, first of all, most of these countries that we're dealing with in Eurasia They also want to keep their balance between their relations with the European countries, with the United States, as well as China. And on the one hand, there are authoritarian regimes. They like nothing more than China providing everything for them, and you know, from all kinds of commodities to everything else. So that creates some sort of a dependency. On the other hand, again, what if these countries, I give you an example, for instance, Iran, which is very much in that category, will have any kind of conflict with the Western world. To what extent your sort of supervision of these countries, or even trying to create some kind of uniformity, to what extent China will be willing to stick its neck out, so to speak, be on the side of US for its interests or on the side of these local countries. As I remember when you were putting together...
So I'm sorry to interrupt you. I do want to make sure we get as many questions as possible, so maybe we can have them consider that very important question.
Right.
So, yeah, thank you. Bruno, would you like to take a shot at that? Sort of choosing sides, picking sides. And I think this might also go to sort of you're either with Huawei or you're against Huawei, right?
Well, so far we've seen that countries try to keep a certain balance, and in fact to leverage China's presence in order to get more from the West. That's what Greece has been doing, by the way. I hear all the time that Greece is going through its golden age of relations with the U.S. I have a new ambassador of the U.S. in Greece, very active, and things are working out. And in some sense, the U.S. is so interested in Greece precisely because of the Russian and Chinese ghosts that are haunting Athens. So I think many countries are doing that. It's a very ambiguous world. It is not the Cold War. And that's true also of the Iran question. I was in Iran recently with my think tank in Beijing. I didn't go with Hudson Institute to Iran. With the Chinese think tank. And, well, the Iranians are very suspicious of China because they don't think China will stick the neck out, as you said. But I think China will do a number of things. They're already doing it, but within limits and always with a certain deniability. But they are buying some Iranian oil, in some cases trying to evade the sanctions, but certainly less afraid of sanctions than Europeans. That's very obvious. And, you know, if relations with the U.S. continue to deteriorate, then you can actually move forward on relations with Iran because you don't have as much to lose. On the other hand, and I should mention this, of course, China does have a problem with the Muslim world. And coming back from Tehran, I flew to Urumqi. And let me tell you that the experience of coming out of an airplane in Urumqi coming from Tehran is, you know, gives you pause about how successful China is being, because it's almost a counterterrorism operation moving into the plane as we land. So China has to deal with this problem. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to continue developing relations in Iran with Turkey and with other very important countries, where it should be moving in as the United States withdraws. But China also has this problem that it has to deal with.
So the program listed that we would end at 7:30. We're going to go on a little bit more until about 7:45, so we can take some more questions. So, yes, please, sir.
Thank you. My name is Wilson from New York City. I was reading a new report by McKinsey, which came out, I think, a couple of days ago, about China becoming the center for the regional global value chain. And my question is, made in China 2025, what do you think about it? How sustainable is it? Thank you.
Just two sentences. I think it is very central, so you probably know that it's been dropped, but it's been dropped only in name. I'm interested to know your opinion. But of course, if you read the document itself, you see that it's central to China's economic plans to move into some of these industries where it can grow very quickly, and some industries that will become dominant in the near future. And China is not giving up on that. including aero industry, where it plans to compete directly with Boeing and Airbus, and many other places where the impact will be very, very significant. And in Europe in particular, we're not prepared for that at all. But I think Germany is already suffering the impact of China's movement into some of these high-tech areas.
Okay, let's take a question here, front row.
Ayşe Kadıoğlu, I'm a visiting fellow here at the Sakıp Sabancı Center. I'm still thinking about when you said you don't see it as an infrastructure project, but compared it actually to the West. I don't know West what, but you know, something big, right? And I can't help but think, even if you know the old-fashioned, I mean, the socialists would say that was a facade. You know, West came with a huge cannon, right? I mean, a thought. And when the English, you know, the colonialists went to Egypt, they at least pretended to liberate women. Although, you know, they were against women's right for vote back at home, you know. So there was this whole thing that came with it. So when I think in those terms, this looks really more like an infrastructure thing to me, or perhaps this is how things are in the post-neoliberal world. It's just pragmatic. You don't have this canon. You don't have the need for this canon anymore.
Can I answer this as well? But I think the other guests should answer as well. But I'm very interested in this question. Well, but China is not that. We in the West tend to think that China is exactly like us, with the exception of some Western values that he has been amputated of. So China is West minus freedom of expression, minus democracy, has some amputations. But no, China is a completely different constellation of values, with its own values that we don't understand and don't subscribe to. And so, you know, in Cambodia, I was in Cambodia for 3 weeks, seeing how China is changing the country in all sorts of ways. New ways to relate to fortune and to chance and to how to become a millionaire. Cambodia is being turned upside down by this vision of Chinese entrepreneurship, because the people that move to Cambodia are the people that cannot make money back home, and they want to make it quickly. And Cambodians look around and they learn. Cambodian society is changing. You go to Djibouti, when I went, there were 2 ports. One was run by DP World, the Dubai company. The other was run by China merchants. In the DP World port, there were no women. In the China merchants port, there were all women. Because I think Chinese managers were more comfortable with Muslim women than with Muslim men. There is a lot of, there's a canon moving in, which is very difficult for us Westerners to understand. But there's a Chinese worldview that is moving in together with the infrastructure.
Great. So I would like to now go to the rapid fire round, right? Where let's just take 3 more questions, keep them as short and pointed as possible, and then we'll come back to the panel for their final thoughts as we conclude. Yes, please, sir, here at the 3rd row.
I'm an American taxpayer. Is this a new form of colonialism with Chinese characteristics? The methodology being, you know, money in hand, many countries with corrupt governments, and it gets a foothold. And can you utilize that influence in some ways like colonialism?
Thank you for that. 2nd row here, Janik, and then we'll go.
Bruno, in the beginning you mentioned, dismissed the rise of Germany or that analogy, but it goes also to Confucianism. Isn't really the rise of Germany the need for, or the wanting, respect, acknowledgement that we're a player? The means are economics, but the motivation is respect, and so therefore that it should be the example. The US is only a means, the economic means. So what's the role of psychology? Political psychology, whatever psychology, but the role of motivation, which I think is the real thing, and that looks at Germany.
Great, good set of interdisciplinary questions. And yes, sir, you've been very patient here, over there. Yeah.
So, Bruno, you mentioned about Japan on the Plaza Accords basically getting knocked out.
Just please introduce yourself.
Sure, my name's Kurt. I'm from New York. I'm really glad you brought up the part about the Plaza Accords. So is it possible for the U.S. to do another Plaza Accord on China? Particularly, the way they did it before is because they have the Mahan strategy, controlling the sea lanes communication. I think perhaps the BRI is a way to get around this, but let me hear from you.
Great. And then let's take one more. Yes, sir, over there. Yeah, perfect. Actually, I have the one in the front. Yeah, in the black t-shirt. Yep, thanks.
Hi, Jamie, also from New York. In your book, you referred to an analogy by one of Putin's advisors, Surkov, likening national sovereignty to economic competitiveness. And I think underlying a lot of the discussion around the Belton Road initiative is the transition to the joining of the two, as sovereignty seems to be increasingly related to the economic competitiveness of different industries, particularly high technology. And I just like to get your thoughts on the joining of the two.
Perfect. Okay, a lot there. So I want to ask each of the panelists to pick and choose what they would like to answer. A lot is on the table, and let's go for about 2 minutes each. Let's start with Nargis, and then we'll move down.
That was a very interesting question, and actually I had it scribbled down in this new order, whatever. What will happen to universalist discourses? Yeah? But I suspect it cannot be like medieval, sort of parochial. Everybody's doing his own thing and just connected by, by these economic corridors and whatnot. I have a feeling that societies are changing, yeah, and society in China is changing, yeah, and that's some the China that we see now. It's by 2049 to be a very different China with so that's something also to keep in mind.
Great, Professor.
I just picked these two, actually connected, infrastructure and neocolonialism. I don't want to separate infrastructure project from technology innovation, because historically, I am a historian, historically they are closely linked. Europeans did this before, they forgot about it. They invented this thing for the railway building led wave of new innovation industries in the late 19th century. Think about it, even Russians get into this. Trans-Siberian Railway, Germans embarked that railway, not to mention the entire world. So, the question is, are you grabbing other people's land for your own people, the resettlement? This is what colonialism is supposed to mean. Now, Chinese don't have it, really. Now, who criticized this most severely at that time is Vladimir Lenin, who wrote a book on this, right? He is right, because he said this way of grabbing land and building infrastructure frenzy will end up war, great power confrontation. He was not wrong in the end, right? He published this famous book, Imperialism. But if you try to, compare with China, it's not the same picture. Right. Right.
Bruno, you have the last word.
Three questions. First your question. I think there's a tendency among us in Europe and the US to have a certain psychoanalytical theory of China, traumatized by the century of humiliation and now looking up to the West, imitating in a conflicted way. I don't buy this because I think this is common to every rising or rejuvenating country. Been reading a lot about the US in the 19th century for a new book. It's exactly the same. In 1819, the US, the only thing it can do is to export its manufacturers, but its culture is not taken seriously. Then they go to Europe and they buy antiques and bring them back here. And then slowly the culture starts to be respected. And then the United States as a political actor starts to be respected at the end. And there's a lot, of course, of emulation and envy of Europe and the way that is solved. It's not different. This exists in China, but it's not different or more violent than in the past in other cases. Plaza Accords, I think Trump wants to have the new Plaza Accords, but he's not going to get them. That's what China has made clear. Anything that puts an obstacle in China's technological development China will prefer anything but that. And so the goal has to be a bit redefined by the Trump administration, but that, if it was the initial goal, to repeat the Plaza Accords, it's not going to happen. And finally, economics and politics, one could speak 4 hours about that. The idea that I'm most interested in the first book is we seem to be entering a world that is highly integrated and highly competitive. And that is very puzzling to many people because you think that either we have integration and then we have also cooperation, or we have decoupling and a Cold War and competition and conflict. But we can have conflict and integration together, as we can see in the marketplace. Companies are integrated with each other. They operate in the same marketplace, but they are competing against each other, in some cases very aggressively. And perhaps nation states are becoming more and more like companies in the market. Nation states will be like big giants, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, competing against each other, but not separate, integrated. In some cases, you're part of the same value chains. In other cases, you're leading different value chains. I think a world with competition and integration at the same time is probably the best model for the world we live in now, and increasingly so.
So I just want to say on behalf of all of these institutions here at Columbia, thank you for connecting us and providing that tissue. Thank you, Professor Kassenova, Xiang, and of course, Dr. Maçães. Thank you.